Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 10 on the peoples of Middle-earth. And tonight, we're kind of moving forward in the one appendix per week movement right now as we continue to work through Tolkien's development of the appendices. And we're getting tonight to what, on the one hand, I'm not going to act like this appendix is the one that I have been most looking forward to discussing, in the sense that, you know, it's like my favorite appendix and I can't wait to see how it evolved. No, by contrast, this is, I think I can safely say, my least favorite of the appendices. Probably the one I've read least often with least care, frankly, and that's the Appendix D on the Shire Calendar. Not that it isn't fun, not that there isn't lots of cool stuff in it, but still, it's weird. And that's what I'm going to be most interested in looking at here today as we continue to look at how the appendices develop. The question that I'm really interested to try to answer tonight as we go through the development of Appendix D is why? Why did he write this? Why do this appendix? Why spend the time that he spent on this? What did this seem to mean to him? What do we see? What can we learn about his interest in this? Because it's, look, the Appendix E and F are, the alphabets and, the scripts and the languages. Those are also obscure, apparently unnecessary, but it's Tolkien, right? I mean, they're the linguistic ones. Obviously those matter. Like, I don't need to ask why he did those. And of course it was wholly unsurprising for us to discover as we've been reading through the Peoples of Middle-earth that he started there, right? Of course he did. But okay. So sure, that one. And again, the rest of them make sense. Like even the genealogy and the family trees, which we were just looking at last time, are, it's the second most random of the appendices. But again, like, it's fun. It's hobbitish. It's, he talks about, he sets it up, right? He almost mandates it by saying that the Red Book is just stuffed full of family trees. So he can't have no family trees now, can he? But then the appendix on the calendars. I mean, one is even tempted. I would even be tempted, knowing how much strain he was under to get things down to size, be like, why didn't you just cut this whole thing? Right? I mean, we could have had more language. We could have had more family trees, right? We could, like, why do it? So anyway, that's one of the things that I want to be exploring. What do we see? What can we learn from this chapter of the Peoples of Middle-earth about the development of the calendars? What can we see? What do we learn about Tolkien's investment in this? Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Real quick announcement before we begin. First of all, just delightful to see several of you at New England Moot this past weekend. That was a great deal of fun. I wanted to mention that next week, so not Thursday tomorrow, but a week from tomorrow, I'm going to be holding a launch event for our fall fundraising campaign. It is time for the fall fundraising campaign for Signum University. The campaign's officially going to begin on the 30th of October, which is next Thursday, and it's going to go through Saturday, the 22nd of November, which is the Saturday before Thanksgiving here in America. So that's when the fall fundraising campaign is going to run. As I say, next Thursday night, I'm having a launch event in which I'm not only going to talk about the campaign and, give you some more information about some of the really fun stuff that we're planning here at Signum, but I'm also going to be doing, for the first time online, a really fun activity that I have done now several times at Moots. And I know some of you who are here tonight have been with me for one or two of them. And that is my randomized literary discussion game, where I have these tables set up which enable me to randomly select a paragraph, basically. Randomly select a paragraph from The Lord of the Rings, or multiple paragraphs from The Lord of the Rings, or multiple paragraphs from Tolkien's whole corpus, or multiple paragraphs from, like, one from Tolkien and one from another work, and do some discussion. Both discussion of that paragraph and discussion of the two paragraphs side by side with each other. And I think that is, it's been so much fun. When we've done it at Moots, it is so much fun. It has, I have had, this game was inspired by a sort of a theory, something almost like, a speculation of mine. I was going to say a boast, but it wasn't like me bragging about myself. It was just a thing that I used to say sort of jauntily, right? That, like, I bet you could roll dice, pick a random paragraph in The Lord of the Rings and have a really interesting discussion. And so I was dared to do it, and I did it, and it's really cool. It's really fun. So anyway, so we're going to, as I say, I've never done that online before. So I'm going to do that online on Thursday evening, sort of as part of the launch event next Thursday night. So that event is Thursday, October 30th at 9 p.m. Eastern time. That's when that's going to be held. This will be a little bit earlier than the normal Mythgard Academy class time, but it'll be next Thursday. All right, let us jump in and talk about calendars. Christopher explains. The earliest text of what became Appendix D to The Lord of the Rings is a brief, rough manuscript without title, which I will call D1. In style and appearance, it suggests association with the first of the two closely related manuscripts of the Appendix on Languages, F1. And that this is the case is shown by a reference to the text, in the text, to the note on Languages, page 11. This, in fact, refers to the second version, F2, which was thus already in existence. D1 was followed, clearly at no long interval, by a fair copy D2 exactly parallel to manuscripts F1 and F2 of the Appendix on Languages, and thus the order of composition was F1, F2, D1, D2. I have no doubt at all that all four texts belong to the same time, which was certainly before the summer of 1950. And probably earlier. In fact, an envelope associated with D1 is postmarked August 1949. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, first of all, remember that when we were looking at F1 and F2, that is the early drafts of the first appendix, the language appendix, this was quite early on. It was firmly and clearly after he finished writing The Lord of the Rings. So it was not during the process of writing The Lord of the Rings. He had finished the story, but then he turned to the appendix. And apparently, he turned to this fairly quickly afterwards. Now, when we were looking at the family trees last time, we noticed that there was a sort of evolution, right? That they began with working texts, like much battered the much battered copy of the original Baggins one, which he obviously had been using as a working document to help himself as he was writing, right? So the emergence of the family trees as an appendix, right, was, kind of came in afterwards, but they had existed before for other reasons in part. Part of him kind of working out the story along the way, sort of, I imagine, in a similar way to him working out the moon phases and things like that, right? They're one of those, like, careful working out of details that of course Tolkien did in order to make sure that his story was consistent. However, the calendar's Appendix D, well, what will become Appendix D, presents itself fairly early on in the process. That is part of the thing that I find so remarkable here, right? So notice what I mean by that. I call it remarkable because it's not strange to me that he starts with the languages, right? The first appendix, which was going to be the appendix to The Lord of the Rings, right, and which becomes eventually Appendix F, right? that he would begin there. Of course he begins there. Why wouldn't he begin there, right? He begins by explaining the languages, naturally. And apparently, impulse 2 was the calendars. So, this isn't exactly an answer to my initial question, but it's an interesting piece of data, right? Why did he bother to include this? Well, one answer of a sort is it was one of his top priorities, apparently. Like the next thing he did, it seems, after writing the appendix on languages, the note on the languages, was to write out notes on the calendars. That doesn't explain, it doesn't answer the question exactly as to why this was so important, but it certainly establishes the fact that it was really important to him, right? So it's any thought that one might have had, which again, I know is a thought that I, have had earlier in my life, when reading through the appendices, and you get to Appendix D and you're like, surely this is kind of shoehorned in here, right? Like, this is a little extra. Apparently not to Tolkien, right? This was front and center. So, okay. So we need to clearly accept that, right? So let's go through. We're going to read a good deal of D1 together here tonight, with some commentary, but we'll see what we learn. In the Shire, the calendar was not arranged as ours is, though the year seems to have been of the same length. For long ago as those times are now, reckoned in years and men's lives, they were not, I suppose, far back in the age of Middle-earth. So notice, from the very first sentence of this, he is insisting on what has always been a really important thing for him throughout the whole dealing with the frame of Middle-earth, even through The Hobbit itself, was that this is our world, right? So the initial framing of the question of what did the calendar look like in the Shire is, well, given that obviously it's the same, like it exists under the same constraints as ours does. It's the same year. It's the same, time passes in the same way, right? Maureen points out once there was a round globe. Yeah, well, that's why he is going to be moving to get rid of the flat world fairly soon after this, right? Chronologically, in like real world time. 'Cause it's got to be the same, right? And notice he even brings it closer. The time of, like the third age of Middle-earth, the time since then, between the time of the story and now, it's a long time. But it's not all that long ago. It was a long time ago reckoned in years and men's lives. But they were not that far back in the age of Middle-earth, right? Compared to like how old the planet is, it was quite recent, right? That is to say, he brings them close together. He doesn't just insist that it's in our same world. He's like, we're pretty much, we have the whole framework in common. According to the hobbits themselves, they had no week when they were a wandering people, and though they had months reckoned by the moon, their keeping of dates and time was not particularly accurate. In Eriador, or the Westlands, when they settled down, they adopted the reckoning of the Dunedain, which was of elvish origin. But the hobbits of the Shire, after a while, altered things to suit their own convenience better. Shire reckoning was eventually adopted also in Bree. It is difficult to discover from old records precise details about those things which everybody knows and takes for granted, nor am I skilled in such abstruse matters. By the way, that's like the unofficial subtitle of today's class, nor am I skilled in such abstruse matters. Right, yeah, no, that's too bad. Anyway, okay. So notice the frame, Do you notice the person? Notice did you notice the grammar of this? Notice the first person. The first sentence begin not arranged as ours is. And in that second paragraph, nor am I skilled in such abstruse matters. Exactly, the researcher again. So he is very strongly speaking in the persona of the modern translator researcher, who is confessing here that although he's a great expert in many things, even to the point, you will remember, of calling out the hobbits, to say hobbits believe this about their history, but they're wrong, right? He's, acknowledging at the beginning that he's not a calendar expert. And he's under lots of difficulties here. So, you might kind of grain of salt this whole section because he can't claim the kind of expertise that he apparently can claim in, like, the history of Hobbit language, for instance. But yes, the frame is very so. The two things that I find so striking about the opening of D2, that is to say, the first draft of this appendix, is first the great firmness with which he contextualizes the calendar systems of the hobbits, the elves, and the Númenóreans in conjunction to our world, and secondly, his strong insistence on that same authorial frame, the one that we saw him developing in the prologue on the languages, and the one that we still see firmly in the prologue of the Lord of the Rings. Now, let's keep going. But in that part of Middle-earth at that time, it seems that the Eldar, who had, as Sam said, more time at their disposal, reckoned in centuries. Now they had observed, I do not know how, but the Eldar have many powers, and had observed many centuries, that a century contains, as near as no matter for practical purposes, 36,524 days. They therefore divided it into 100 years, or sun rounds, of 366 days. And dealt with the inaccuracy, not as we do by inserting at intervals an additional day to make up for the deficit, but by ejecting a few days at stated times to reduce the surplus. Every 4 years they would have used 3 days too many, if they had done nothing to correct it. Normally they divided their year of 366 days into 12 months, 6 of 31 and 6 of 30 days. They alternated from January to June, 31-30. From July to December, 30-31. It will be observed that their months thus had the same lengths as ours, except for February, 30, and July, 30. Every 8th year, they got rid of their Isn't that a funny coincidence that the Elvish calendar was that close to having the months have the same exact days that our months have in our calendar? Lots of funny coincidences in this appendix. Every 8th year, they got rid of their excess of 6 days by reducing all months to 30 days. And these years were called equal month years, or 30-day years, changed to 60-week years or short years. Okay. Yeah, so they don't have leap years, Maureen. They have stumble years, right? You don't leap forward, you stumble backwards, right? In Elvish years. By the way, notice how beautifully that fits. So on the one hand, you can see two fascinating ways in which he is here doing real world building. How would elves measure time differently? One of the things that I really love when we see Tolkien doing, and we certainly saw this a lot in Morgoth's Ring and in the War of the Jewels, and of course we see it a very great deal in its own way in the nature of Middle-earth, is we see him really beginning to think like elves. This is not something Tolkien did originally, I don't think. That is, when you go back to the Book of Lost Tales and the Quentin the stuff he was writing in the teens and 20s and 30s, even the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion, you don't see that much of an effort to really think like elves, to really ask himself the question, like, how would elves approach this? There's stories about elves, right? And the elves sometimes within them act differently than humans might act. But it's still not exactly, it's still not like his early stories aren't really trying to think through the world from the elves' perspective in the same way that he really begins to do later on, right? Post Lord of the Rings, in other words, right around this time, he begins thinking more and more practically about how does the worldview of the elves differ from the worldview of the humans, like the normal kinds of world things that we take for granted, right? And two things that jump out at me here. One is, of course, the long measurements, right? They don't think in terms of years exactly. They think in terms of centuries. So they measure, they do not measure that the year has 365 and a quarter days, right? That was what I learned in school. But that's not how elves thought. Instead, elves multiply that by 100. Notice that there are 36,524, not 25. So it's not quite a full quarter of a day. They think in these longer terms. So that's one thing. But the other thing, did you see it? With how they do the not leap year thing? Why do you see why I think that's particularly elvish? They divide the century up. They divide the year up into 366 days, knowing it's too many. So what do? They lose days. Exactly. They stop time. They don't want to speed it up, right? They throw days out the window, right? Now, of course, they're going at the same time, but I think it's just interesting to me. Again, think of the metaphor involved in leap year. We're leaping forward. That's what we say with leap years, right? Elves aren't going to leap forward. That's not going to be an attractive way to think about time for elves, right? Yeah, they linger. Jackie, it's almost like every single year it's like the elves are trying to distend time every year, right? And then they must like guiltily give back a few days, right? Every few years. It's the elvish tension, right? The Dunedain altered these arrangements. They favored the number 7 and also found a 7-day week more convenient. They also preferred a system by which all the months had the same lengths and did not vary at intervals. Struck out later, they had 12 months, not 13, so that the year could be divided into 2 exact halves. Yeah, I think that gets struck out because it's a little bit weird because the elves had 12 months also in the previous paragraph. He must have changed his mind sort of midstream there. Anyway, in Gondor, therefore, and in most regions where the common speech was used, the year had 365 days. There were 12 months of 30 days each, and 52 weeks of 7 days each. But the method of dealing with the extra 5 days differed in different countries. In Gondor, between June 30th and July 1st, they placed a kind of short month of 5 days, which were called the summer days, and were a time of holiday. The middle day of the summer days, the 3rd, was called Mid-Year's Day and was a festival. Every 4th year, there were 6 summer days, and the mid-year festival was 2 days long, celebrated on the 3rd and 4th days. In the last or 100th year of a century, the additional summer day was omitted, bringing the total to 36,524. Yes, Eric, I agree. 13 suggests a lunar calendar, but it's interesting that nobody seems to have a lunar calendar. Although it's clear that the concept of the month is associated with moons. In this version, we don't have anybody actually just working off of a lunar calendar, right? Yeah, well, but not in this one, Eric. Not in this. Not in this. That's you're thinking of D2, I think. But yeah, yeah. Jackie, I agree. Jackie says this is so nature of Middle Earth. Yes, which means like in my vocabulary, Jackie, saying something is this is so nature of Middle Earth means really in the weeds with detailed world building, right? Lots of math. Yep, lots of math, which we can see that Tolkien quite liked. And we learn in the nature of Middle Earth that he becomes almost obsessed with, in fact. But yeah, in other words, this is beginning to add up to a partial answer to my question. Why? Why do this, Tolkien? Because it was already starting to happen, right? I have argued that I think that one of the big picture, one of the things that we see when we look over Tolkien's entire career, we can see that in the beginning of his career, Book of Lost Tales period, Quentin Oldarinwa, Lay of Leithian, back in those times, but especially in the Book of Lost Tales, he was doing mythography. He was writing myth. That was his passion, was to write mythology. And right around now, the writing of The Lord of the Rings, the completion of The Lord of the Rings, ushers him into a new era, really settles him in a new era. And that is the era of writing, I'm tempted just to call it realistic fiction. Realistic in the sense that he wanted to work out all of the details realistically. He's no longer content with, and I don't think he would approve of my saying just writing myth, but he doesn't write myth anymore. He wants to make it all in romance form. You call it nonfiction-y fiction? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, pseudo-history. Yes. History, real or feigned, right, Emily? Thinking of the foreword to The Lord of the Rings. Immersive subcreation, Eric, that's a good way to think of it too. Yes. And that's exactly right, Haradiel. It's why he never finished the Silmarillion. He spent the rest of his life working out the details. Exactly. So I do think that more clearly than anywhere else, and I mean anywhere else, in The Lord of the Rings, if you want to see a portent of what is coming in Tolkien's creative life, Appendix D, right? This is it. So why did he do this? Why did he go here? Because he was really interested in this. Because clearly he had been working this stuff out. It's obvious that he didn't just sit down and be like, so I should do math or something, figure this out, right? No, he had been doing math to figure this out. In fact, I rather suspect that he had been coming up with ideas for what the calendars looked like, but hadn't indulged himself to really sit down and work it through. And that's what he did. He wrote his introduction to the languages. And then he's like, what do I want to do next? Ooh, I know. I want to actually sit down. It's time, right? It's time to work out all that calendar stuff that I've been thinking through. Just Green Great Dragon calls it fact fic. I like that. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Yes, Jocelyn and David Michael, that's exactly right. When I said romance, I'm meaning the literary genre. Romance meaning meaning a story, meaning a long, continuous narrative. What we would probably, in modern English parlance, call a novel. But Tolkien did not use the word. I mean, it's not like he never uttered the word novel, but he did not describe The Lord of the Rings as a novel. It was a romance. And that's because like that generation, like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's generation of readers and critics, still used the word novel in an older sense. The novel, it was, we now call any work of fiction in prose that's sufficiently long a novel. If it's not long enough, we call it a novella, meaning a little novel, right? So it's novel. Exactly, David Michael. That's just it. Novel had a technical definition, right? Like it had to meet certain criteria to be officially a novel. And Tolkien didn't like those criteria. He was not trying to follow that model. He was not writing a novel. He was writing a story. It wasn't an epic either. Epic also has a technical definition and has to meet certain qualifications in order to be considered an epic. And Tolkien, of course, was even more familiar with the definition, the details of what it means to write an epic than he was about novels. So again, romance was the generic word. That was the medieval generic word for a long prose narrative that may or may not be fictional, essentially. That romance came to be associated with love and love stories, so that now in the modern usage, the word romance, especially when applied as a genre word, is exclusively about love stories, right? It's I mean, that's also the fault of the Middle Ages, by the way, just because like what were the most popular kinds of stories that everyone was writing and reading in the Middle Ages? Love stories, right? So the romances were romantic in the very limited modern sense. But anyway, okay. But let's get back to the calendars here. Yeah, Marie and I, exactly. That would be in the category of like, say something that sounds like a really hot take, but actually is just a super boring statement. Yeah, like post on social media, like The Lord of the Rings is the greatest romance of all time, right? Like, I think it's kind of a generic statement actually, but it would sound like a pretty big hot take, right? Exactly. Sounds like clickbait, Adam. I agree. Anyway, okay. All right. But let's keep going. In the Shire, and eventually in Bree, where Shire reckoning was finally adopted, there were 3 summer days, called in the Shire the Lithe, or the Lithe days, and 2 Yule days, the last of the old year and the first of the new. So how did the hobbits differ from the Númenórean calendar? Instead of having the 5 days, the 5 special days in the middle, they do it twice. They've got summer days and they've got winter days, right? So you get 2 little extra bonus stretches in your year. Every 4th year, there were 4 Lithe days, added except in the last year of a century. The Lithe days and the Yule days were the chief holidays and times of feasting. The additional Lithe day, called Overlithe, that's like the leap year equivalent, right, was a day of special feasting and merrymaking. Yule was in full the last week of the old year and the first of the new, or in Shire reckoning, since December had only 30 days, December 24th to January 7th inclusive. But the 2 middle days of the period, Old Year's Day, or Year's End, and New Year's Day, or Year's Day, were the great Yule days, or Yule proper. So I hope that you all join with me this year in a movement that I'm going to try to try to to spark, which is I want to stop calling it New Year's Eve and move that we call it Old Year's Day instead, because Old Year's Day followed by New Year's Day. Come on, that's awesome. That's so much better than New Year's Eve. And it's not New Year's Eve, it's Old Year's Day. Come on, that's so good. I think I was going to say it needs to come back. It kind of never was. It needs to get actualized, right? So this year, no, we're not going to celebrate New Year's Day or New Year's Eve. We're going to celebrate Old Year's Day. Exactly. The year gets its own day of remembrance like a wake. And indeed, like a wake, you can celebrate it pretty much the same way as people celebrate New Year's Eve. And then you celebrate the birth of the new year, right? There we go. Okay, anyway, we'll keep going. The Hobbits introduced one notable innovation, the Shire Reform. They found the shifting of the weekday name in relation to dates from year to year untidy and inconvenient. That is how things shift forward. Like, this of course still happens in our calendar, right? Where, today is October 22nd and it's a Wednesday, and last year, October 22nd was on Tuesday, right? So that's the sort of drift that he's talking about. So in the time of Isengrim II, they arranged that the odd day, which put the succession out, should have no weekday name. So Mid-Year's Day, the second and middle day of the Live, had no weekday name, and neither had Overlive, which followed it in every fourth year. After this reform, the year always began on the first day of the week and ended on the last day of the week, and the same date in one year always had the same weekday name in all other years. In consequence of which, the hobbits never troubled to put weekdays on their letters. They found this very convenient in the Shire, but of course, if they travelled further than Bree, where the reform was not adopted, they found it rather confusing. Now, this, I think, provides me with another big part of my answer to the question. As Eric says, it is so organized, right? Notice what he's done here explicitly. He's taken our calendar, because there's no question that this is based on our calendar, right? I mean, the similarities, the amount of overlap between this calendar and our familiar calendar is enormous. But what's he done? He's neatened it. He's smoothed off all the things that are weird about it. Every month has the same number of days. You don't have to try to remember. Like, it's one of the weird things about our calendar, right? You've got to memorize this whole weird rhyme to figure out which number of days which month has, right? And then you've got that thing where, like, every year, you can't, like, I think of academic calendars, of course, for my own personal bias, but like, you can't say that classes always start on this particular date because next year that date might be on a Saturday, right? Instead of Friday or whatever. So like, you've got to keep changing the dates year by year instead of just being able to use the same date all the time. So the months are all even. The days of the week are all even. You've got these extra fun holidays built into the annual calendar. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Tengwar alphabet, right? It's not technically an alphabet, but it reminds me of Tolkien's complaints about the Latin alphabet and how irrational it is. Now, his complaints about the Latin alphabet are much more extreme. Good. Absolutely. Catriona, yeah, I'd missed that. Catriona was just saying the same thing. Exactly. That's exactly it, right? He objected, Tolkien, that is, objected to the Latin alphabet because it was nonsensical from a, linguistic, phonetic standpoint, right? He wanted something neat and orderly, and so created like the neatest, most orderly alphabet in the history of the world, which is Tengwar, right? Form matching function, Eric, exactly so. But again, really, it's neat, it's tidy, it fits, and it's predictable, and it's lovely. And he's done the same thing with the calendar. The Shire Calendar is gorgeously tidy, with none of the weird irregularities that all of our familiar calendars have, right? So again, this is another partial answer to my question, right? First, because he was clearly now in the onset in 1949, in the onset of that passionate delight in sorting out details and figuring out how everything works and organizing all of the facts of Middle-earth and its history, such that, as we see through the end of his life, the sorting out of those facts largely supplanted the writing of stories for him, which is, of course, in the end, the sad thing. But I can't tell somebody how to enjoy themselves, and this was clearly how he was enjoying himself. But further, the calendar thing is not just a random manifestation of that desire for order, for working out all the facts, right? It is also, like the alphabet, less radically so than the alphabet situation, a chance where he can say, we can do better, right? And I think that that's really, really fun. Herodiel, he was very interested in Esperanto. He liked Esperanto a lot, but the problem was there were no stories. What he didn't like about Esperanto is that it was like made in a lab. And he was like, he said of Esperanto, this isn't going to work. And it's not going to work because it's not organic enough. Like it doesn't have any life to it. There aren't any stories in it. There's no mythology of Esperanto. That's why he did what he did. That's why he wrote stories, because he wanted his languages to have life, and languages only get life when you tell stories in them. And his stories, of course, took their life from his languages themselves. The history makes the language, and the languages make the history, right? And so he really admired Esperanto. He's like, that's great. What a marvelous thing, right? But it isn't going to work. And it isn't going to work because it's sterile. It's sterile. It's never going to mean anything to anybody. And certainly people aren't going to adopt it because it's just sterile. Yeah. Anyway, okay. More. Oh, by the way, I now have to apologize in advance. Just in the last few minutes, I have received delivery of a small and somnolent dog who is sitting right over there and snoring intermittently. So if you hear little puppy snores in the background, that's what you're hearing, just to let you know. So apparently the small dog was insufficiently somnolent upstairs and got turfed downstairs to me. Yeah, just when you hear the strange noises, that's what they are. Okay. Now here's where the calendar appendix meets the language appendix. In the above notes, I have used our modern month and weekday names, though of course neither the Eldar nor the Dunedain nor the Hobbits actually did so. But dates are both important and easily confused, so that I thought a translation into our familiar names essential. These may very properly be allowed to represent the usual names in Gondor and in the common speech. But in fact, the hobbits of the Shire and of Bree adhered to old-fashioned month names, which they seem to have picked up in antiquity from the men of the Anduin Vale. At any rate, very similar names were found in Dale and in Rohan. This is the reference to the note on languages. The original meanings of these had been as a rule long forgotten, or they had become in consequence worn down in form. Math, for instance, at the end of 4 of them, is a reduction of month. There was some variation in the names. Several of the Bree names differed from those of the Shire, and in 1 or 2 cases the East Farthingers agreed with Bree. Okay, so really, lots of really fun stuff here. So he notes, like, when you hear dates like March the 25th in The Lord of the Rings, that's a translation, right? They didn't actually use March. There are lots of places where dates are brought up, and he just translates them into the modern English usage, but he emphasizes that's not the original. This is exactly like we saw in the translation appendix, but do you notice the difference? Yeah, so Eric is delighting to point out that, of course, the word month, in fact, comes from Old English, the language which the language of the Rohirrim is basically based on, for monoth, Monath, monoth, is the Old English word that the modern English month word comes from. So he's paralleling, right, the diminution of monoth from Old English into month in both Middle and Modern English, if I'm recalling my Middle English correctly. So that's why he's referencing the men of the Anduin Vale, which is, of course, where the Rohirrim came from. So linguistically speaking, that makes sense, sort of. But do you notice? There's no intervention of the common speech. That is, remember, all that stuff, both the modern English and the Old English, or near Old English, all of that is translation, remember? Translation of the actual language that they were speaking, which was quite different. So let's keep watching this as we go. But what he's not doing here is giving us versions of the months in the common speech. That is, like, in, Neo-Adunaic. So that's really interesting to me. Okay, so here are the months. He gives our equivalents, and then he gives the Shire names and the Bree names. So we have After Yule for January, Solmath, which he has the letters are for notes, pronounced Somath. So we got Somath, which is the same in the Shire and Bree. Then Wreath, Astron, which is Chithing in Bree, Thrimilch, which he explains. Okay, pronounced Thrimage, also written Thrimich and Thrimage, the latter being already most usual in Bilbo's time. So May is Thrimage, April is Astron, June is Forlythe, July is Afterlythe, August is Wedmath, September is Hallemath, October is Winterfilth, November is Blotmath, and December is Foryule. Okay. I like Bluting, personally. Bluting is my favorite. That is the Bree month for November. More notes. Often, Blotmath, often pronounced Blomath. There were often jests in Bree about Winterfilth in the Shire, after the Bree folk had altered their name to Wintring. But the name had probably meant filling, complete. That is, it doesn't mean filth, like actual, like dirt or something. The name had probably meant filling, completion, and may have derived from the time when the year ended and began in October after harvest. Winter was indeed, as still with us, often used for year in reckoning age. That is, he was a lad of 8 winters, right? Yes, Blomath is a very English sort of wearing down, David Michael. And I agree with you. That's a trend that we can see through a lot, just like the pronunciation of Solmath as Somath, right? That's also a very English wearing down. We remember from the appendix on languages that Hobbit names, as they're given in the text, are supposed to evoke English usages. They're supposed to sound familiar to English people. So that seems to be, in as much as he's giving us translation here, that seems to be the translation that he's doing. But do you see what I mean? Like, he skipped a step. So thinking of names, for instance, right? What's the name of Frodo's servant? You know, the one that Frodo goes to Mordor alone with? Banazir. Right? But he doesn't call him Banazir in the text, because that would sound weird and very non-English. It would sound alien to an English reader. So he doesn't call him Banazir. He translates it to Samwise, because they basically mean the same thing. And, you know, Frodo's servant was called Ban for short, and so they call him Sam for short, and that feels all comfortable and Englishy, right? So in other words, you've got the original actual Hobbit name, Banazir, and then you've got the modern English translation that is given to us in the text to make it sound home-like and familiar. Okay? That's Samwise. Now, do you notice what I mean? There's an extra step here. What's the actual Hobbit? Just as when a Hobbit actually addressed Mr. Gamgee by name, they would, except Gamgee wasn't his name either, right? I know. But anyway, when Frodo's servant was addressed by name, they were actually uttering the syllables Banazir. But when they're referring to the first year of the month, first year of the month doesn't even make sense. First month of the year. But let me say the second month, actually. When the hobbits are actually uttering the name for the second month of the year, what are they uttering? I don't think it's Somath. Because these do sound exactly, David Michael, as you were saying. These sound like English names. In fact, Winterfilth is in fact English. It's from Old English. It's what they called that month. It's what the Saxons called that month. So, and even his last note there on translation, talking about how these were derived from the Vale of Anduin, and you can see their relationship to their languages, points to to them as English or English-ish, right? Not as common speech, not as what the hobbits actually said. But then, David Michael, that's exactly right. They've been double translated. Because then he translates them from this, which are like quasi-English month names, into January, February, March, April. Because those months are going to be familiar to us. And if it would sound, we wouldn't be able to follow it, right? If Gandalf's letter to Frodo said, make sure you leave the Shire no later than the end of Afterlife, right? Everybody'd be like, what? But since we know it's, the beginning of October, and Gandalf's letter says before the end of July, okay, the reader's good. So you see what I'm saying? He doesn't give us the common speech version. He's not, in fact, doing the same step of translation here. And that's really fascinating to me. It's really fascinating to me because we saw him just refer to, explicitly cite the appendix on languages. We know, as Christopher has said, this clearly came afterwards. He just wrote that thing. Wrote and revised it. And yet he doesn't follow its template here. Why not? Well, there's already an extra step in here. To truly follow that, he would have to say, well, it wasn't actually Somoth or Blomoth or Winterfilth or For Yule. Yule? Really? That's obviously a translation, isn't it? Isn't it obvious that Yule must be a translation? That wasn't what they were saying in the common speech? But he never even hints at the common speech here. In other words, I think that so I do believe, and David Michael, that's exactly what I conclude also, that this is already complicated enough. If he did add the yet another dimension of this, it would, they'd need more than a table, right? They'd need like a stiff drink and they probably would give up. So he doesn't even go there. But you know what that shows me? The conclusion I feel I must inescapably draw? He prioritized this calendar stuff over the linguistic stuff. We saw how much fun he was having with that common speech stuff, right? We might not all love it as much as he does, as he acknowledges in the prologue. Or sorry, not the prologue, in the appendix. Both, really. We might not love it as much as he does. But he clearly loved it. And yet here he's setting it aside to pursue something else that he loves. Do you see what he's choosing over it? He's setting aside his own made-up languages, the common speech that's based on Adonaic and all that stuff. He's setting aside one of his newest and shiniest, made-up languages. One of his newest and shiniest conlangs, Adonaic. And he's doing something else instead. What else is he doing? What he's doing is looking at the relations. He's taking our real calendar and he's fixing it. And he's going back. It's not a coincidence that he's going back to these Anglo-Saxon terms. He is not just saying, let me take the modern calendar and fix it. He is saying that, but he's doing more, right? Yes, Green Great Dragon, he's building real world continuity. But of course he's doing that in his favorite way by going back in time, in our time. What he's built begins to look something like, what would happen if we, this would be an unfair way to say it, but it's almost like, what would our modern calendars look like if the Saxons were never conquered? We had spoke Old English continuously, and we'd cleaned up the calendars in the meantime to make them much neater, right? It's there's more going on here, but it's almost like one strand of what he's doing. He has lost himself. He has the opportunity to just totally invent from scratch a brand new calendar, like he was doing with the Elvish calendar that he described, right? Totally new approach. But instead of that, he could just be like, all right, I'm going to make it totally different. I mean, he could have, right? He could have made a calendar with let's make a calendar with 4-day weeks or 9-day weeks or something like that, right? He could have just done it totally differently. But he didn't do it totally differently. It is, as I've already mentioned, again and again, very persistently, coincidentally, almost exactly like our calendar. Because what he's done is almost set aside his desire to do subcreation, like real, not that any subcreation is de novo, but like de novo subcreation, and instead say, no, let me go back. Let me think about the Venerable Bede's calendar. You'll remember Christopher's note on the Venerable Bede's note on Winterfilth, right? And how his note here, that the name Winterfilth probably meant filling or completion and may have derived from the time when the year ended and began, which is kind of like the Venerable Bede's commentary on the word Winterfilth, but not quite the same as it, right? He's kind of taking on he's kind of acknowledging the Venerable Bede, but like tweaking it in a different direction. I mean, that's the game that he is choosing to play here with the calendars. And it's fascinating to me that he does that instead of just going all in on the world building, and instead of going all in on the languages. He sets both of those things aside and he's like, no. Let's play with the Old English calendar. And let's invent the new Old English calendar. Not the new English calendar, the new Old English calendar, right? The new Anglo-Saxon calendar. The Hobbit week was taken from the Dunedain, and the names were translations of the names given by the Dunedain following the Eldar. The 6-day week of the Eldar had days dedicated to the stars, sun, moon, the 2 trees of Valinor, the sky, and the Valar or rulers. 6 days. In that order, the last day being the chief or high day. The Dunedain kept the dedications in order, but altered the 4th day to Tree Day, with reference to the eldest tree of which a descendant grew in Númenor. So, like that little, the elves remembering the 2 trees, but the Númenorians make it about them, right? And their white tree. And desiring a 7-day week and being great mariners, they inserted a sea day after the sky day. So they still keep the high day as the last day. But they squeeze in an extra day. You've got a sky day and a sea day. The hobbits took over this arrangement, but the meanings of the days were soon forgotten, and the names reduced in form. The translation was made more than 1,000 years before Bilbo's time. In the oldest known records of the Shire, in the earlier parts of the Great Writ of Tuckborough, the names appeared in the following archaic forms. This completely blows my mind. Sterrenday, Sunnenday, Monenday, Truesday, Heovenesday, Meresday, High Day. But in the language of the Red Book, these names had become written Sturday, Sterday, or Stirday, Sunday, Monday, Truesday, Heaven's Day, Mersday, High Day, and Heaven's Day was universally pronounced Hensday, and often written Hensday, H'Nsday. The spelling Sturday with an I, usual in the Red Book, was due to the fact that, the old meaning being forgotten, Sturday, which began the week again after the holiday of High Day, was popularly supposed to be connected with stirring, which we'll get to later on. Jackie, doesn't this sound like, as you say, it sounds so believable, right? Doesn't this sound like a better explanation for where our days of the week came from than anything you've ever heard about our days of the week? Right? I mean, it's like he is convincing us. He isn't just starting from the premise that Middle-earth is our world and so therefore has the same number of days in the year and hours in the day and all that stuff. But like our calendar is actually derived from his mythology, right? It's pretty remarkable, right? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Hen's Day, Mer's Day, High Day. Yeah. And then, of course, Saturday and Sunday. There are names, just very slightly changed to fit into his mythology. But Jackie, as you say, they sound more authentic than our days. But let me go back to the thing that blows my mind. Remember when we just said, so he's already doing, right? He's already doing the translation of the things that we know, and then a different version of that, which is strange to us, but kind of familiar in feel, but if you're English, but still different, right? Wreath and Somoth and Blomoth, what does that even mean, right? So clearly it would be like over-egging the pudding, right? For him to do yet another set of translations into the common speech, right? Into the Adonai common speech. And yet, here he does another set of translations. He does it right here. Here's a third version of the days. There's our familiar days. There's the Hobbit days. And there's now he does in fact give a third set. Except they're not the common speech set. It's an archaic set from the Great Writ of Tuckborough. He's giving us the equivalent of the Old English form from 1,000 years ago. Again, what he's done is create this like artificial history of our own calendar. Here is a fake version. It's like you can see it looks like, oh, our days must come from that, right? Clearly, there's no coincidence that this sound like so much like our days, because clearly our modern days were derived from the Hobbit calendar. And here he's like, and here's an artificial history of where those came from. Right? Isn't that remarkable? Now, I agree, Eric, these don't look and form much like Old English words. They do look a little bit more like Middle English. But they would, wouldn't they, Eric? That is to say, though chronologically 1,000 years before would be, from now 1,000 years back would be Old English. But of course, within the economy of Tolkien's translation, Old English equals Rohirric, right? Equals Vale of Anduin. So it's in the Vale of Anduin. If we got the version from the Vale of Anduin, we'd be going all the way back, right? And so what he's giving us here from the Great Writ of Tuckborough lies halfway in between modern Hobbit, which is modern English-ish, and the Vale of Anduin, right, which is Old English-ish. And so it's kind of Middle English-ish in the middle. Middle Hobbit-ish, Eric, that's exactly right. It's just, the reason this blows my mind so much is that this little table of the archaic versions of the Hobbit days of the week is the most ridiculously unnecessary part of this ridiculously unnecessary appendix. Right. And that's why to me it's so conspicuous and so delightful. He can't help himself. But again, he's indulging himself, but not in his normal ways. He's not indulging himself with common speech and Adonaic. He could, he does in other places, but he's not doing that here. Instead, he's indulging himself with this quasi-Middle English, quasi-Old English pseudo-history of our calendar. And it is charming. It's fun, it's charming, and it's Tolkien all over. But it's Tolkien indulging a different passion. A related passion to his, like, the kind of linguistic passion we saw in the Proto Appendix F, but it's related. It's different, but it's related. Just as the kind of fun with English place names that we can see in Farmer Giles of Ham is like, related to, but not the same as, his delight in naming things in Elvish, right? Yeah, Horatio, I agree. It's like we're seeing another facet of his personality. Yes. 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 Notice, by the way, one of the conclusions of this, it's almost like he's backtracking. Like he said, I had to translate. I had to use modern words like July and Tuesday in the Lord of the Rings, just to make it easier for people to read. But now it's almost like he's saying, like, actually, no, they are the same. I just changed them a little bit, right? It's so cool. Because look what he goes on to do immediately afterwards. Since the Hobbit names are accidentally somewhat like our own, it's the purest coincidence, and two are identical in spoken form, I thought it would be inconvenient to translate them according to their order. I have therefore translated them according to their sound. But it must be remembered that the associations in the Shire were different. Translated, the week runs Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But Saturday was the first day of the week, and Friday the last. In associations, Saturday was more like our Monday, and Friday like our Sunday. The month names I have, as explained above, translated, but for fear of getting into confusion, I have left Bilbo's and Frodo's dates unchanged. That is, I have kept the Hobbit lengths of month. This only closely concerns this book at the turn of the years 1418 to 19. It must then be remembered by those who wish to follow the various movements of the characters that while December 1418 and January 1419 have, because of the addition of a Yule day to each, the same length as ours, February has 30. So that, e.g., March 25, just in case you find that day significant, would be March 27th in our reckoning. So you see what he's done? He's provided helpful hints here in case you want to do the math yourself and work it out. But this also does mean that whenever we celebrate dates significant in Middle-earth, we're doing it wrong, right? Like we celebrate Gondorian New Year, or I celebrate Gondorian New Year. People like to call it Tolkien Reading Day, which is fine, though. I always say that it's like Breathing Day, but I like to remember the actual celebration. It's Gondorian New Year, right? And I don't like to celebrate Hobbit Day either. I like to call it Bilbo's birthday, like Frodo would have done. But yet we shouldn't be celebrating Gondorian New Year on March 25th. It isn't on March 25th. It's on March 27th. It's on March 25th of the Shire Reckoning. Yeah. Painful truth. By the way, this is also part of the fun. So many of you know this, but some people don't know this. A lot of modern people don't know this. That for hundreds of years in Europe, there were two different calendars. There was the Julian and the Gregorian calendar. Oh man, I will never forget. I was a researcher when I was in grad school. One of my part-time jobs, I had like 18, I was a research assistant for an 18th century specialist. And I did a lot of, researching in, early 18th century publications, magazine publications and things. I can show you the book I contributed to. My name is in the dedication if you read really carefully. But anyway, so I did lots of research for a summer for this 18th century scholar. And it's maddening because they use one calendar in England and they use the other calendar in France. And so when you're talking about the dates when events happen, you don't know which calendar they're using. And there was like 2 or 3 days. I forget. I think it was 3 days separating the two of them. So, you'd be like, oh yes, this battle, which occurred on like the 14th of July, and it's a sea battle between France and England. And you're like, wait, according to whom was it on the 14th of July? Was it really the 4th? Because I'm like, English dates are what we care about. This was, this was English scholarship. Anyway, yeah, the Russians used a third, but fortunately I didn't have to deal with that. But anyway, the point is, it is like a fact of European history that for centuries there were different calendars used, like what he described with like if a hobbit went much further away than Bree, it was very confusing because like different days of the week would be on different dates and their things wouldn't line up. Again, this is coincidentally like the real world situation for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yes, the difference grew over time. Adam, that is true. So it wasn't even stable. It was just, it like in different years was different amounts. It was, I'm telling you, like, it is no joke trying to do historical research, like like European, research during those periods. But anyway, so like he has created the same situation. A claim that I'll give Mark. Oh, Mark, I'm blanking. Why can I not remember Mark's last name? His screen name in Discord is Flamifer. And he gave a talk at New England Moot a few years back. And he was arguing that Tolkien did a really, really clever thing there. Because March 25th is, now I'm blanking again. I'm just having like senior moment after senior moment here. What's the Catholic feast that March 25th? It's the Feast of the Annunciation. Yes. March 25th was the Feast of the Annunciation on one calendar, but in a different calendar, the Feast of the Annunciation was on March 27th. Like on the other European calendar, it was on March 27th. And so Mark's claim was Shenham, of course, Mark Shenham. Mark Shenham's claim was that basically he arranged it so that the fall of Sauron would be on the Feast of the Annunciation, no matter what calendar you used. And it's like, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. He was like weighting the dice, right? But again, the point is, this is a known thing. This is a phenomenon, right? And he has imported even that real world phenomenon into his world, and is playing with that, right? So once again, the calendars are radically tying Middle Earth to our world, right? The very first observation we made on slide 1, we're like, again and again, we can see this. This is the whole trend that I'm seeing with the calendars. Okay. Christopher points out, it will be seen that the account of the Eldarin calendar in Middle-earth given in D1 bears no relation to that in the published text. Moreover, while the Shire Calendar as described in D1 was preserved without change, it is much more closely based on the Númenórean system than in Appendix D. In D1, both calendars had a year of 12 months of 30 days each, and the only difference in that of the Shire was the distribution of the 5 summer days of Gondor into two Yule days and 3 summer days or Lithe days, the leap year day of Overlithe or 4th Lithe day, corresponding to the 6th summer day in Gondor. In Appendix D, on the other hand, that is in the published version, the Númenórean calendar had 10 months of 30 days and 2 of 31, with the 3 extra days being Yestare, the beginning of the year, Loende, the midday, and Metare, the ending of the year. So they had 3 one-day festivals instead of 1 5-day festival. That's what's in the published version. So here, this is just Christopher commenting on how it grew and how it changed. One little brief observation I will make about the shift from the original version to the published version here is the use of the quenya. That is a trend we are going to see continue. Let's, here's Christopher's note on the translation issue. In writing of the names of the months and the days of the week, my father used the word translation. He was referring, of course, to the substitution of, e.g., Thursday for Mersday or March for Wreath. But it is to be remembered that Mersday, Wreath, etc. were themselves feigned to be translations of the true Hobbit names. Here's his allusion to the common speech thing we were discussing. We do not know what the real translation of the Númenórean name, Oriaron? Or Oriaron, I have a hard time saying that word, Oriaron, was. The theory is that my father devised a translation of the Hobbit name, which he knew, though it doesn't say in the appendix, in archaic English form, Mersday, with an EI, later Mersday, and then substituted Thursday in the narrative. The rhyming of Truesday, Hensday, Mersday, Highday with our Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, he naturally called an accidental likeness, but it was an astonishing coincidence. I am much inclined to think that the Hobbit calendar was the original conception, and that the names of the days were in fact devised precisely in order to provide this accidental likeness. I certainly agree. If this is so, then of course the earlier history of the names of the week, going back to the 6-day week of the Eldar, was a further evolution in this extraordinarily ingenious and attractive conception. It is notable, I think, that the Elvish names do not appear until the text D2, where the Sindarin names are called, as is to be expected, Noldorin. Yeah, just an astonishing coincidence, Maureen. Yes. So note here, Christopher observes the same thing that we did, but he kind of downplays it. When he says, I take it that when Christopher says, my father devised a translation of the Hobbit name that is the common speech name, which he knew, Christopher says that Tolkien knew the Hobbit name for the months and days. That is, that he had, in fact, translated that stuff into common speech. You know, the Neo-Adonaic. If that's so, but he never says. He doesn't even hint at it in D1 or D2 or the published Appendix D. Now, am I surprised to learn that Tolkien had derived common speech retcon translations of these? No, of course not. Of course I'm not surprised. But what I do find remarkable, and which Christopher doesn't comment on at all, which, whatever, is the fascinating fact that he doesn't mention it. I mean, remember how self-indulgent Tolkien was being in that, first appendix on language? The delightful self-indulgence of that? You'd think it at least would get a note. Wouldn't you expect? Tolkien would be like footnote. In case you're curious. For those who are interested in such things, the common speech versions of these days of the week were as follows, right? Come on. Isn't that what he did all the way through the first appendix? But he doesn't do it here. Eric, that's my question too. Eric says, did he write it down anywhere? Or did Christopher just know that he knew it from conversations? Again, we're not given it. Christopher doesn't give it to us. So, and I've got to think he would. I've got to think he would give it to us in a note. If he had it. I think he doesn't have it. Or can't find it. And that leads me to one of a few conclusions. Either A, Tolkien, like his father told him what the common speech words were, like in conversation, as you say, Eric. But they didn't write them down, and he's not going to try to reproduce it from memory, right? So he's alluding to it, but he's not going to give it to us. That's one option. Option 2, Christopher doesn't know, but assumes that his dad must have done that. And he probably wrote him down somewhere. I just haven't found him. That's also seems possible to me. That Christopher is merely deducing or even assuming that Tolkien did in fact devise those names. Yeah. I don't know. But I think that as is not uncommon, as you all know, for those of you who have been with me on many, golly, it's probably hundreds of hours now of time that we've spent on the history of Middle-earth together. Christopher is much more cautious in making wild interpretive statements than I am, right? I am much more free with wild flights of interpretive conclusion than Christopher was. So it's hardly surprising that Christopher doesn't make very much of this fascinating fact that he alludes to very indirectly, but that it seems to me much more significant. Now, Eric was mentioning this, and Maureen had mentioned the same thing. The reference to the theory is that my father devised a translation of the Hobbit name, which he knew in archaic English form. It does sound weaker, like he's not sure. I think that when he says the theory is, I believe what he's referring to is this seems to be the schema that he's operating under, right? In other words, I think that what Christopher is doing here is pointing out the same thing that I was pointing out, that the original names, which have been translated into modern English usage, original names like Stursday and Afterlife, or Blomouth, are not common speech. So he's saying based on the schema which Tolkien had adopted and even alluded to in this appendix, he must have those things. But my problem is, which he knew sounds almost as definite as the theory sounds indefinite. So I'm not really sure. And Maureen, I think whose theory? Tolkien's theory from the first appendix. According to the theory that Tolkien was developing, right? According to the schema Tolkien was unfolding in the appendix on languages, this must be true. And probably Tolkien knew them, the names, the translations. That's how I'm reading that. But it's that which he knew sounds to me fairly confident, but I think it might just be confident because he knows his dad really well. And he's like, I don't have the evidence. He never said them to me, but I know my dad, and there is a 0% chance that man did not in fact make common speech translations of those. If that's what that means, if which he knew means nothing more than that, I'd buy it. Anyway, let's keep going. Yeah, if anyone knew, Christopher does. Exactly. I'm not going to doubt him. Much more briefly through the second, I'm not going to go through the whole second draft, just a few things I wanted to point to, and then we're done. The calendar in the Shire differed in several features from ours. This is the new beginning. This is the beginning of D2, the second draft. The year seems to have been of the same length, for long ago as those times were now, reckoned in years and lives of men, they were not, I suppose, very remote, according to the memory of the earth. It is recorded by the hobbits that they had no week when they were still a wandering people, and though they had months governed more or less by the moon, their keeping of dates and calculations of time were vague and inaccurate. In the westlands of Eriador, when they had begun to settle down, they adopted the reckoning of the Dunedain of the North Kingdom, which was ultimately of elvish origin, but the hobbits of the Shire introduced several minor alterations. This calendar, or Shire reckoning as it was called, was eventually adopted also in Bree, except for the Shire usage of counting as year 1, the year of the foundation or colonization of the Shire. Now, notice that in his second beginning, he's shifted the frame a little bit. First of all, notice what it's kind of hard to notice what we don't get. Notice how much less of the first person singular or plural we get here. We get that sentence about how close it was. It was not very remote according to the memory of the earth, right? We get that differed in several features from ours, but notice how much more distant the persona of the modern researcher is here. We get that one first person singular, I suppose. So we hear his voice a little bit, but we don't get him interfering. It's less of the modern framework is one thing that I notice about this. The second thing that I notice about this is that notice how it starts out with a much more hobbit-centric kind of anthropological approach. Instead of just starting off with calendar started with elves and then the Númenóreans adapted them and then the hobbits inhabited that, right? Like that's the way the D1 goes. Here, this whole paragraph begins with a perspective that we don't get in the first version. The hobbits is a wandering people, governed more or less by the moon, with only vague calculations of dates that were vague and inaccurate. We don't even glimpse that era of Hobbit history. So one shift that we're already seeing as he's revising Appendix D is that he makes it much more Hobbit-centric, which is interesting. And I don't think it contradicts the overall frame. It actually just makes it a little bit more Red Book-centric, really. But that's an interesting shift. Notice this is very similar to what we get, but there's a big difference. The 6-day week of the Eldar, this is not right afterwards, this is skipping a bit. The 6-day week of the Eldar had days dedicated to or named after the stars, the sun, the moon, the 2 trees, the heavens, and the Valar or powers, in this order, the last day being the chief or high day of the week. Now you'll remember that's where that ended. And then we immediately shifted to the Númenóreans in the first draft. Look what we get now. Their Quenya names were Elenya, Anaria, Isilia, Aldaria, Menelia, Valaria, or Tarinar. The Noldorin names were Argiliath, changed to Argilion, Aranor, Arethil, Argalaid, changed to Argaladath, Arvenel, Fenel, Menel, Arveline, or Adorin. The Dunedain kept the dedications in order, but altered the 4th day to Argalad, tree day, so what was Argaladath becomes Argalad, with reference to the elder tree only, of which the white tree that grew in the king's court in Númenor was a descendant. Also desiring a 7th day, and being the greatest of mariners, they inserted a sea day, Aroiren, Quenya Earenya, after the heavens day. So, you see what he's done? He's added all the language stuff. He's not just added the language stuff, though. Notice what he's also doing? He can't help... Yes, Jackie, he's teaching. Exactly. He's given us another little Rosetta Stone fragment, right? Eric, as you can see, you're like, oh, wait, right, okay. So I see that ya in Quenya, the YA ending means like day, right? Because they all end in ya. And the Noldorin ones, which we'll someday call Sindarin, all start with R. So this shows me that R means day in Sindarin, or excuse me, I mean Noldorin. And also they put the day at the beginning. Notice that? You see, like all of the, it's like little elvish, it's like he's throwing out the breadcrumbs, right? To entice you to learn more Quenya and Noldorin/Sindarin. The thing with the tree, conceptually, it's still cool. From the 2 trees day to the 1 tree day when you shift from the elves to Numenor. But it's even cooler when you're like, oh wait, Argaladath is plural, whereas Argalad is singular. Now I understand how. So if I go back, I can see all of those Noldorin words in the Lord of the Rings that end in ATH. So like Argonath is plural. Boom. Right? Yeah. So it's like, that's what he wants, right? That's what he's hoping for. Yeah. Yeah. So cool. So much fun. Really interesting. So, I talked about how he seems to be choosing calendar stuff over language stuff to some extent with the common speech things. But as we can see in the 2nd edition, it's not like he's not going to seize the opportunity. It's not that when he looked back, he didn't say, you know what that could be in here? More meaty language stuff, right? And yeah, Eric, that's the trick, right? Assuming he hasn't changed the languages much between here and publication. Yeah, always a rash assumption. Okay, even more briefly. He moves, at the end of the 2nd version, he moves into the 4th age. New era. Gondor calendar of the 4th age. After the downfall of Sauron and the return of the king, a new calendar was devised in Gondor and adopted throughout the realm and in all the Westlands. This was calculated to begin on the day of the fall of Barad-dûr. That took place in 3rd Age 3019, Shire Reckoning 1419, on March 25th, according to the Shire Reckoning, King's Reckoning, and the Elvish calendars, March 27th in our calendar and March 26th in the Steward's Reckoning. Don't worry about it. In honor of the halflings, hobbits, their weekday Sunday for 25 March was taken for the first weekday of the first year of the new era, and so became also the first day of every week. Notice that? What day did the week begin on? Saturday. Now what day does it begin on? Sunday. Just like our week begins on Sunday, first day of the week, right? Once again, he has shown us how our calendar derives from this calendar, right? And yes, March 25th was the first day of the new year in the medieval calendar. Lady Day. Yeah. Annunciation Day. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It was always the new year. Yeah. Yeah. That's why February, Chaucer fans, I know that's a fairly niche group. But if you've read the, Merchant's Tale, right? February and May. February is an old man, is the name of an old man. May is the name of a young girl whom he marries. Like he's like 60 years older than she is. That's a calendar joke, you see, because February is the end of the year, because March is when New Year is. That is the, it's the like liturgical New Year. There's the calendar New Year, and there's the liturgical New Year. Anyway, on the day of the Annunciation, which is the day of the Incarnation, is the beginning of the year, liturgically speaking. But the calendar year begins in January. So January looks both directions, towards the new year that's about to come and back to the old year that just kind of ended, sort of, in one way of looking at it. And then February is kind of the oldest month of the year. And then May is the early spring. Anyway, that's... But yes, this is as much as to say, yes, March 25th was New Year's Day in the Middle Ages. It's also payday. Even for like 19th century servants would get their pay on March 25th, May Day. Or sorry, Lady Day. Not May Day. That was a different day. And yes, February is the lame duck month, which I think is why it gets the shaft as far as number of days. But anyway, okay. In honor of... Also, the Shire reform was adopted, by which Mid-Year's Day had no weekday name, so that weekday names remain fixed in relation to dates, and each year began on a Sunday, Anaria, and ended on a Saturday, Elenia. So notice how... So one of the things that he's pointing to happened in the Fourth Age is that the Hobbit calendar now influences the Númenórean calendar back, right? It was based on the Númenórean calendar. Now the Númenórean calendar is basing its new calendar on the calendar of the Shire, right? And of course, as we're seeing, drawing it even closer into line with our actual usage, such that, notice that, like, because that Shire calendar is so perfect, ours modern calendar feels like it's like the original calendar decayed, right? We've lost the perfection of the Shire calendar. It's based on it. Our modern calendar is based on it, but it's decayed over time. The calendar of months and seasons was also entirely reformed. The year now began with spring, 25 March, Old Style. It was divided into 5 seasons, 2 long, 3 months, and 3 short, 2 months. Spring, April and May. Summer, June, July, August. Autumn or harvest, September, October. Winter, November, December, January. Stirring, February and March. Stirring is really interesting. It's a fun 5th season. I like it. It's... Sorry, what it makes me think of, stirring is aptly associated with what is basically the beginning of maple sugar, of like maple syrup season up here in New England. And that's where the stir day thing comes from, STIR, yes. When he said it's based on stirring, this is the stirring that he meant. Each month was 30 days long. There were thus 5 days, or in leap year 6, outside the months. These were 2 spring days before April. So again, remember, this is the new Gondorian calendar we're describing. There are now 2 spring days before April 1st, which began the new year and were festivals. Mid-Year's Day fell between September and October and became now a harvest festival. In leap years, this day was doubled. The year ended with 2 stirring days after March 30th. These days were days of preparation for the new year and of commemoration of the dead and fallen. Dates were usually given in official documents by the seasons, but the old month names, common speech, Noldorin or Quenya, remained in private and popular use, though their incidence was somewhat altered. They began and ended earlier in the year than in older calendars. I love the way in which he thinks through, like, it's kind of casually dropped out there, right? And again, this is just another example of one of the things we were observing before, Tolkien's passion for working things out that he is developing, right? Remember I talked about the difference between Tolkien as myth maker and Tolkien as fact-fic writer, Green Great Dragon, thinking of your version of that. In The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn just says, oh shoot, is it Aragorn or Gandalf? It's Gandalf, who says that the new year shall not, like, you know, in Gondor, the new year shall now begin on the 25th of March, right? That just gets thrown out there. So yeah, from now on, this will be New Year's Day. And nothing else is made of it from that point on. We don't see that worked out, right? But he kept working it out. And look what he's working out. What does that mean? Like, if you suddenly make March 25th the first day of the year, where are your festivals? Like, notice now, instead of a Midsummer's Day, middle of the year, now the middle of the year is in the fall. So it's a harvest festival instead of a midsummer festival. That's interesting. And this whole concept of stirring. Uncoincidentally, stirring is February and March. That is to say, the very end of the year, before the new year begins again. So that the shift now recharacterizes the year. So that instead of beginning in January, which is the middle of, like, the end of December, beginning of January is the middle of winter. Right now we have the transition from stirring into spring is now the new year. So it like the concept of the year and the flow of the year changes. And we see, like, Tolkien was clearly like, okay, I said that, but I need to work out what that feels like, what that's actually going to do. Right now, I know I'm way over time. We're about to stop. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I will just suffice to point out, this is such a beautiful table that he made. And I think about his frustrations with the published appendices. When he's producing something like this, I'm sure he sent this or a copy of this to Allen and Unwin, and they were like, hey, typesetting department, what do you say? Right? I mean, think of not just the beauty of the writing, the thoughtfulness of this design, the math, the graphical ability, the visualization skill, the language. It's like so much of art and learning and thoughtfulness that has gone into this, right? This is Tolkien sitting down and saying, I need to understand. I made that throwaway comment, but I'm no longer content just to make a mythic proclamation like, from now on, the new year shall begin on this day, which gives that day this mythic resonance, right? No, I'm going to do this now. Christopher ends, and since I'm so late, I'm not even going to read this whole slide, but with a note that of how, remember that he was talking at the end of the language appendix discussion, how frustrated Tolkien got trying to crush it down and fit it in and make it work for the published appendices. And Christopher just emphasizes that everything that he said there can be repeated of Appendix D with greater force, right? It was even worse. Him trying to squeeze all this calendar stuff and make it work in a way that would work for the publisher. And this really, it is one of the things that I take from these few chapters is that Tolkien, again, you read those letters about how frantic he is trying to make the appendices work, trying to get the appendices together. And you could make the mistake. I know I made this mistake for years. You could make the mistake that the problem that was delaying the publication of The Return of the King was him producing material. But as we can see here, he wrote this 6 years before the publication of The Fellowship of the Ring. Well, no, 6 years before the publication of The Return of the King. Anyway, he'd had it for 6 years. So it wasn't producing the material. That was the problem. It was working it out for publication that that was the real problem. And that just puts the frustrations of 1954 through 1955, the agonizing hiatus between Frodo was alive but taken by the enemy and the beginning of book 5. It just puts it in a really different context. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Next time, history of the Akalabaith. I don't know if we'd be. I'm gonna have another go. We've been doing a chapter a class for the last couple of weeks, and it feels very heady. So I'm gonna have a go. We'll see if we can do it. I'm gonna try. So read the history of the Akalabaith for next time, and we'll keep moving. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.